So our union has achieved so much, and what really excites me is what's going to come next. COVID-19 showed us that we can achieve things that once seemed impossible, like working from home. Of course, the union movement has a long history of achieving the impossible. Today, I'd love for us to start the conversation about our next impossible goal. What are the new frontiers for us as a union? Where do we want to go? And more importantly, at this conference, what role can each of us play in getting there? In this session, we'll be hearing from three brilliant speakers who will discuss their work in fighting for new entitlements to make our society a fairer place for all. The format of this session is that each of our presenters will discuss their campaign work and will then facilitate a question and answer session. First, we have Natalie Lane, the New South Wales ACT Secretary for the Australian Services Union. Natalie will be speaking with us about the union movement's campaign for family and domestic violence leave, which started as an entitlement in a single enterprise agreement and now applies to every working person in Australia. We'll then go to Mary Crooks. Mary is the Executive Director of the Victorian Women's Trust. Mary and her team started the fight for paid menstrual leave as a workplace entitlement, work that the FSU has now built on to secure this entitlement for workers in our sector. Mary will today be discussing how they built the campaign for this important entitlement, as well as their latest campaign called Ourselves at Work, which assists people to institute reforms in their workplace around positive mental culture. Finally, we'll go to Gareth Murphy, Head of the Industrial Relations and Campaigns at the Finance Services Union in Ireland. Gareth and his team have campaigned for the right to disconnect to ensure we're able to stop work at our finishing time without an expectation to be continually contactable by our employers. Gareth will discuss how they've secured this entitlement and what comes next. This panel will be facilitated by Nicole McPherson, the VicTAS Local Executive Secretary, and I'll hand over to Nicole now.
Thank you, Izzy, and thank you so much for our panel guests being here today. Unions are at the leading edge of creating new workplace entitlements. This is one of our core roles in society. We push the boundaries of what working people need and what we deserve. This is how we have achieved everything we have today, from an 8-hour working day to family and domestic violence leave. Some of these entitlements, like having a weekend, are so entrenched that many people don't even know that their union wins. These are entitlements that only exist because working people have come together and fought for them. We have a proud legacy and we must never forget our power. In this session, we will be speaking about emerging entitlements and what we want to be famous for as FSU leaders. When we are thinking about securing our core entitlements at work, active union members with the support of their union community are absolutely vital. So many of our entitlements started with a single union, a single enterprise agreement, or even a single union member. From the minimum wage emerging from the Harvester case back in 1907, to the ASU in bargaining with the Surf Coast Council in Torquay, Victoria, securing the first ever entitlement to family violence leave in an enterprise agreement in 2010. Minimum wage and family violence leave are now entitlements that every working person in Australia has access to. This has come through years of campaigning by union communities and taking issues from ideas to legal entitlements. And this work continues today. In September this year, one of our members in Melbourne called me to say that they could not receive a COVID-19 vaccination because they didn't have enough leave and couldn't get an appointment after work. That one member phone call started an FSU campaign where we ultimately won vaccination leave for more than 220,000 finance workers. And we now start the project to make this entitlement law for everyone. All of the entitlements we fight for together not only improve our workplaces, but they make our society more equitable. Our society is better for family violence survivors having access to leave, and our society is safer if we can all access a COVID-19 vaccination. Work-life balance and all of the entitlements to go into giving us work-life balance, they improve quality of life for everyone. This is a core role of trade union communities and activists, to push the boundaries of workplace entitlements, to fight for modern, progressive workplaces where we are all treated with dignity and respect. Our history of creating better workplace entitlements continues, stronger than ever, and each of you here play an incredibly important role, from identifying issues for us to pursue to working on our campaigns. Our speakers today will be discussing taking an issue from an idea through to an entitlement. And as we all listen to them, let's think about the areas that excite us and the changes that we can start to make in our workplaces. I will now hand over to Natalie Lang, who will take us through how unions and allied organisations have secured family and domestic violence leave by turning ideas into policies and ultimately into an entitlement for every working Australian. Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks so much, Nicole, and thank you so much, comrades, for the opportunity to come along and get to join you in this discussion this evening. If I can start by acknowledging I'm joining you today from our office here in Penrith, so I'm on Darug land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's really great to get to come along and talk about something that is so important to ASU members as paid family violence leave. And it was only really in thinking about this conversation tonight that I sat down and did a bit of a timeline and went, oh, in 2009, workers in Australia didn't have family violence leave, paid or otherwise. It didn't exist in Australia. And now in 2021, the situation is that actually every worker in Australia has at least some entitlement to family violence leave. In the National Employment Standards, where we were told it would never ever get legislated, we have 5 days unpaid leave. And 1 in 3 workers in Australia right now has access to at least 10 days paid family violence leave through the achievements of trade unions in enterprise bargaining. So that's an incredible way to come in just 12 years. And I know, like at the beginning of the campaign, if I say it'll take just 12 years to get somewhere, you'd be like, no, no such thing as just 12 years. But to step back and look at an entitlement that we know absolutely unequivocally saves lives, that is something about gender equity and really makes a difference, then to say we've got here in 12 years, that's pretty exceptional. So in 2009, what happened? I remember Ludo McFerrin coming along and speaking at New South Wales Trades Hall about an exciting new initiative that the Women's Domestic Violence Clearinghouse had developed. So please let me start by acknowledging Ludo and the women at the DV Clearinghouse, because as much as the trade union, we can be incredibly proud of the work that we've been doing to secure paid family violence leave. We didn't invent it. It was women who were charged with looking at the scourge of family violence and where the system fails women. It's an incredibly complex system to navigate it. I hope that you never have to try to navigate it or support somebody to, but that's what our members do every single day as frontline family violence workers. And it is a complex system. And unfortunately, women do slip through the cracks. And one of the cracks is not having support in the workplace to be able to attend appointments, to be able to connect with services, to be able to make safety plans to leave violence, etc. And so the DV Clearinghouse looked at this and they said, workplaces must be part of the solution. Workplaces have a responsibility. Family violence is a workplace issue, so too must the solution be. And I remember Ludo coming and speaking at New South Wales Trades Hall. Give me a wave if you were there or if you've heard Ludo speak, especially around the time in 2009. And I sat there as a baby organiser and I went, oh, wow. Oh my God, yes, we have to do something about this. And the great thing about Ludo's approach was one lesson that we can all take away from it: give everyone a job. She gave us all a job and she told us what our job was, and it was really achievable. She said, you're an organiser, go and bargain for it. Put it in your enterprise agreements that you're negotiating. Oh, right, okay, that's what we're going to go and do. And that's what we do as unionists. We give everybody a job. So congratulations to Ludo and the women at the DV Clearinghouse, Organising Principles 101, and what a success. In 2010, the ASU proudly achieved the first paid entitlement to family violence leave at Surf Coast Council. And again, that's an important lesson for us. From little things, big things grow. From achieving it one workplace at a time, we build the momentum. And the great news is when we win it at one workplace and the sky doesn't fall in, it's the best ammunition that we have to counter the arguments that come back at us about, what about the cost? Oh my gosh, the cost of doing business is going to be terrible. To be able to say, hey, look, here are all these other workplaces and businesses. Not one of them has gone out of business as a result of having paid family violence leave for their workers. So each time we achieve change just at one workplace, it builds to the very next change. And then what happened was in 2015, to go to Nicole's point about that one conversation, I remember the one conversation very clearly, and my colleagues just left actually for the day, but my colleague at the time was not my colleague at the time. She was one of our delegates working in a frontline women's service. And she called me just to say she was having the worst day. Just, oh my gosh, I'm calling the union because I've had the worst day. Because Turns out rarely members do call us just to say, hi, just calling, I'm having a great day at work. I thought I'd share it with somebody. Sunshine and rainbows, great news everywhere. They call us up and say, I'm having a shithouse day. It's absolutely terrible. She didn't say the union has to do something about it, but the union had to do something about it. She was a court advocate supporting women who were experiencing family violence. And that day, she spent the day as an advocate sitting in the safe room at her local courthouse and had 2 women who had to leave the courthouse as a result of not being supported by their employers to be present in court. She had a childcare trainee who was called and told by her employer while sitting in the courthouse that she had exhausted all of her leave, and if she didn't return to work, she was going to be terminated. And that young woman in that moment had to make a decision about whether she went through the court process to keep herself safe or whether she went back to work because she couldn't afford to lose her job and lose her financial security. Because how do you leave violence if you don't have an income? And so she went back to work. And so Sam called me. She was irate. And she said, how do these women have bargaining power to negotiate it in their workplace? We said, that's right. Actually, your right to safety, your right to justice, your right to live with dignity and respect should not be dependent on who your employer is. And that's something that the trade union movement very proudly has a history of doing, is ensuring that no worker is left behind. And that was the birth of the We Won't Wait campaign, a campaign for a universal entitlement to paid family violence leave, that every single worker, no matter who your employer, would have this entitlement. And how far we've come. When we started that campaign, there was one state that supported paid family violence leave, and they'd just been through a royal commission into family violence. And congratulations to Dan Andrews and the Victorian government being the first government to enter the 21st century. But no one else did. Now, when we stand back, we look at it, we go, every single state and territory government supports paid family violence leave as a principle for every worker and also provides it to their workers, including places like the New South Wales Liberal government, who when we first met with them said, you want another national employment standard. There's 10 of those, aren't there? So you want 11. And I thought, oh my God, I'm in an episode of This Is Spinal Tap. Has anyone seen that movie? This is Spinal Tap, they're like 11's more. I was like, oh my God, do I have to get an amplifier and show 11's more? I said, well, if we want round numbers, we could go to 20. I reckon I could develop 9 more employment standards we could go for. But we got there. And we've still got to keep getting there because 1 in 3 workers has paid family violence leave. We need 3 in 3 workers, Australian workers, to have paid family violence leave. So how does it happen? Counter every single argument that you get, no matter how much it makes you want to crawl up into a ball and scream into a pillow. Some of the objections that have been raised with me are the stuff that you just think, how did somebody say that out loud? I mean, I'm worried that they would think that, but then they would actually open up their mouth and vocalize it. Oh my God. So comments like Miranda Devine saying that if we had paid domestic violence leave, divvy would be the new sickie. So you have to counter that. You can't let those things go through to the keeper. Enter Sam, our fantastic delegate who started the campaign to go toe-to-toe with Miranda Devine. Sam is smarter than Miranda Devine. Everyone could see that. Countering arguments about cost. Oh, goodness, when they'd say, but what about the cost to employers? And you go, hang on, I just outlined about how 1 woman a week is dying in Australia as a result of family violence, that 800,000 women in the workforce right now are living with the trauma of violence. And you want to ask me how much about the cost to employers. So you go like this, and then you yell at a tree pole, and then you go and you find a fantastic economist like Jim Stanford and you say, okay, let's cost it. We know that there's employers who've got it. We know that none of them have gone under. We can actually win this argument on their terms that they want to argue about. And then we even the ledger and we said, well, what's the cost to employers? It's 5 cents per worker per day. What's the cost to women in leaving violence? And guess what? We were able to quantify that. It's over $18,000. It's 141 hours of undertakings to be able to leave violence. So let's look at that ledger and whether that's fair. Other great arguments that I've had, I remember meeting with politicians who told me I had to get this into the public domain. I had to be part of the common narrative that when they walk down the street, someone would stop them and say, hey, I want to talk to you about paid domestic violence leave. I'm like, great, okay, that's easy. And I was like, but look at all of the commentary that we've got. Look at all the people we've got supporting us. And I was told we needed a story in Clio. And so you can imagine, I'm like, Clio, the force for great social change of Clio. But picked myself up and I contacted the deputy editor of Clio and I found out why this politician hadn't read it in Clio. It was out of publication. They don't make Clio anymore. But we did get it into Marie Claire and we figured that was an acceptable alternative. My message is, no matter how infuriating the argument, The forces who oppose us will always oppose us. They will say something that will make us so angry, that will make us so upset because they're wrong. That's why they're on the other side of the argument. We have to rise up to those challenges. We have to actually answer them head on because we can, because we're right. And I want to say this, when we think about what is it that we want to be famous for, it all started with the most dangerous thing in the world, an idea. Ludo and the women at the DV Clearinghouse had an idea. And then they talked about that idea. They did what workers do. It starts with the seed of an idea. It blossoms with leadership. And that's what all of you do. When you take an idea and you show leadership and you take that idea around and you share it and you spread that message and you say, we can all do something. And we all give each other jobs and we all accept that people are going to contribute in different ways to the campaign. I live and breathe this campaign. It's from the moment I wake up in the morning to the moment I go to bed, and sadly in my dreams. That's what this campaign is to me. I don't expect that every single unionist is going to have that level of engagement. But I do expect every single unionist to care a little bit and to do something when I ask them. When I ask them to send a letter, I want them to send that letter because that is what we do as trade unionists. It's solidarity. It may not be their number one issue, but if it's your number one issue, don't be shy in asking people to play their part. The other thing is absolutely every opportunity that you go to is a lobbying opportunity. I don't think I'm ever going to get invited to dinners that don't cost money for you to attend. When you go to those dinners, make sure you bail people up. Make sure you do lobby them. The number of lovely photos that I have photobombed in the background, you'll see me. I'm generally that person who after the event is a flying head in the background. I promise you the words coming out of my mouth at that time are say paid DV leave. It's not that catchy for a smile for a photo, but every opportunity is a lobbying opportunity for you to make your mark. It's a seed of an idea. It's being cared for and nurtured by leadership, and it will come to bloom through activism, which is what every single unionist has at their heart. It's why they're unionists. If they weren't unionists, if they weren't activists, they wouldn't be unionists. We have solidarity, we have unity, we have activism, and we have hope, and that's why we will be able to win from little things. Big things absolutely can grow. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I would also like to really acknowledge the amazing work of Ludo and the women at the Clearinghouse and the amazing work of the ASU as well. The overwhelming majority of FSU members have access to paid family and domestic violence leave. That's come from fantastic work by our members, but the absolutely incredible foundational legacy that was created by the ASU and the activists as well. Really wonderful. Our next presenter is Mary Crooks, who is going to be presenting on ourselves at work and shifting views on menstruation and changing workplace culture. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Nicole. And it's delightful to be here. And I really enjoyed your presentation, Natalie. And I think once we get past Prime Minister Morrison's pledge to set up a commission on family violence, we might start to turn his attention to investing much more in strategies that focus on the perpetrator of that violence. I'm on Wurundjeri land in Northcote in Victoria, and we at the Women's Trust, we are very proud of having now at least a 30-year-old partnership with Koori Women Mean Business in Victoria. Leanne Miller is the head of Koori Women Mean Business, Yorta Yorta Woman, and she maintains that the partnership between her Indigenous organisation and ours is unique in Australia in terms of a 3-decade partnership. We stand together, and my point is, in terms of acknowledging country, that this is where reconciliation, the rubber hits the road in standing together. Look, I want to talk briefly about one campaign of the Women's Trust. We have many, many campaigns, and we know that sometimes you've got a campaign for 10 to 15 years at least, such as what we did in Victoria over a decade ago to abolish provocation from the statute books, where it was at that time where a guy who could kill his intimate partner and then plead that he was provoked by her, and so he killed her. And we got that off the statute books that had been there for a couple of 100 years. We fell into the work on menstruation and menopause, but that's a long story. But suffice to say that when we published our book in 2019 called About Bloody Time. That culminated from 5 years of intensive work. We ran a survey of 3,500 people. We had 22 discussion groups of all age groups across Victoria. So we actually amassed a level of evidence that hadn't existed. And what was quite striking about it, I expected the younger cohorts to be much more savvy, to be much less embarrassed and awkward about their menstrual cycle. And what sort of shocked me was that there was no difference across the age cohorts, and that these incredibly street smart, savvy young women that were working with me were in much the same cultural trap around menstruation and menopause as I had been through my adult life. And women soldier on. They soldier on, and there is this fairly awful menstrual taboo across our society. So we published the book. We, for example, in the book, had a very long and detailed section about the cycle from cradle to grave, the cycle of a woman menstruating and going into menopause. And we did that because consistently our findings showed us that women, no matter how educated they were, for example, they were still fairly ignorant about their whole cycle and the physiology of their cycle. So we went to great lengths to depict all of that in plain speak. And we did that for two purposes. One, because we wanted a standalone section of the book that enabled a woman to access fantastic information all in the one place. But we did it because by the time you get to the end of that section, you have, grudgingly or not, a reverence for what is pretty majestic, for the physiological integrity that goes with menstruation and menopause. But we did it for a second reason, which was to show that if the situation of menstruating and going into menopause has such integrity, why is it so demeaned? Why is it considered by women to be a source of shame and awkwardness and embarrassment? And that women who can be great buddies, women through friendships know to talk about just about everything, and yet women themselves didn't even talk to one another about their menstrual cycle and their going into menopause. So since we published the book, it has had a rippling effect globally and in Australia. It's now, I'm pleased to say, I've just not long ago signed the contract for it to be published in Germany, which is a great development. But before we even published it, it was having a profound effect on us in our small organisation. We're only less than a dozen workers. There are two men on the staff of the Women's Trust, and you've got to be a bloody good bloke to be on the staff of the Women's Trust. I can tell you that. So before we even published the book, we'd been profoundly affected by our research and our thinking about it, and we just thought it was axiomatic that we needed to introduce a menstrual leave policy for our organisation. We were the first organisation, I think, in Australia to do so. And it basically comes from the assumption that menstruation and menopause is not an illness. It's not an illness. So why should women be forced to take sick leave? Simple proposition. So we formed a policy which basically has three parts to it. And it says, if you're feeling crap when you're having a day of heavy bleed, if you're feeling crap and you're at work, then you can quite legitimately find somewhere in the workplace where you can relax a bit more, take your laptop, lie down, hot water bottle, whatever. The second position is, if you're feeling crap and you're at home, but you feel as though you can put a productive day's work in, then you can work from home in your jammies, and you can, your remote working from home policy kicks in. But we said, if you're feeling so crap that you can't be a productive person on that day, then you can have up to 12 days of paid menstrual leave a year. So we introduced that. We had media, the way Natalie was talking, the invariable backlash. We had coverage on the project and other forms, and the backlash pretty much, I think, came largely mainly from men, but some women. And it was mainly the sort of suck it up princesses, what next? The sky's going to fall in, it's going to cost employers, and so on. And I, like Natalie, I think backlash is good. Backlash shows that you're achieving things. Backlash shows that you're being noticed. So how to deal with it, you forge on. And I've spoken a lot about our campaign since. In 4 years, in a small office, but in 4 years, we've had about 30 days of paid menstrual leave taken. So it averages about 4 days per staff person across a small office. What we've got in return as an employer is profound. We've got, I think, significant productivity improvements even. We've got significant attachment and loyalty from our staff who feel as though management is coming from a place of care. And there is much more open discussion across the office. It might seem embarrassing to some of you, but wasn't to me. I was quite delighted as somebody who was postmenopausal to walk past desks and hear some of my younger staff comparing which menstrual cups were in fact more effective and more environmentally sustainable. So we're much more open as a culture in the office. I think people's relationships with their partners are even stronger because there's a lot more mutual understanding around these issues and respect. It's had a rippling effect. We've had many, many inquiries about how to start the process of menstrual leave, menopausal leave. We are just about to launch in the next fortnight an e-document called Ourselves at Work, which is a guide to helping people introduce positive menstrual culture across their workplace. And one of the things we emphasise in that guide is talk to your union. Whatever you do, talk to your union, but then start conversations across the workplace. So my final point would be to say that, and we've got time in discussion, but in terms of a campaign, to me, the menstrual taboo and the need to smash the menstrual taboo is warranted because I think the kind of taboo and the stigma attached to women's menstruating bodies is one big piece of the gender equality jigsaw. You can't be considered an equal or take your place equally in society if you and others feel there's something very, very sordid and insufficient about your body. It's as simple and as complex as that. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was fantastic. I'd also like to really acknowledge the fantastic work of Mary and her team at the Women's Trust for bringing this issue into the public discourse. For anyone at the FSU, any of our members who has bargained recently, you'll know that this is now something that we're including in our logs of claims when we're doing enterprise bargaining. So it's ultimately going to become that kind of norm that family and domestic violence leave has, but we have to recognise the incredible work of Mary and the team to start that process. I'll now hand over to Gareth Murphy from the Financial Services Union in Ireland, who is going to talk to us about their campaign for the right to disconnect.
How's it going, everyone? And greetings from a very early Dublin, Ireland. Apologies about the halo above my head. That's not deliberate. It's fairly early in the morning. This is actually the first time I've spoken today. So if my voice is a little bit, just give me a break. So I'm delighted, firstly, to send greetings from the FSU in Ireland to all our brothers and sisters in Australia. It's always great to work with trade unions in other countries and learn from trade unions, most importantly, and from your progress and struggles in other countries. So we're delighted to work with you here today. I'm really happy to talk about our campaign on the right to disconnect, which has been fairly successful over the last couple of years, but is not finished and is always ongoing in terms of cultural change, which I'll mention, I suppose, at the end. But where this really came from is, I'm sure every trade union member and trade union leader and official will have noticed, I suppose, over the last decade that mental health and work-related stress and burnout and work intensification was probably becoming more and more part of your everyday phone calls and conversations with trade union members or colleagues in work, etc. And we just anecdotally, without collecting evidence, we're just hearing this more and more throughout 2014, 15, 16 within our union and within our sector. And then at our conference in 2018, a number of delegates put forward a motion that linked really technology to mental health and work-related stress. And they didn't explicitly call for a right to disconnect, because frankly, we had never heard of that and no one knew what that was or that concept or that approach. But they did say to us that technology was having this increasing impact on their mental health in a negative way. And they called on us to, us, I should say, the staff, they called on the staff of the union to look at doing some research around what was causing mental health challenges, and in particular the impact that technology was having on our work and on work-related stress. And we hear employers talk a lot about well-being and wellness, and their solution to anyone struggling with mental health in work is, you know, do some yoga or go for a walk, but they never seek to investigate what is causing your challenges at work. Is it unachievable performance objectives? Is it that you're not getting paid overtime? Or is it that you're being contacted out of hours repeatedly, or you're being contacted on the weekends or on your days off or on your annual leave, or you feel you just can't take that time off because, you know, your work just builds up and who's going to do it? So all of that kind of anecdotal evidence and feedback was going around, and then our members mandated us to look at it further. And I really like the idea that I think it was Natalie who said, sorry, I don't know Natalie or Mary, so very nice to meet you. But I think it was Natalie who said that, you know, one member or one phone call or one idea can suddenly blossom into a national issue, an international issue. And I just think that's really true. So in our case, it was a couple of our delegates who wrote a motion from one of our workplaces who really kickstarted our activity. So we partnered up with a university, the University of Limerick, who conducted a survey of with, I think it was 3,500 from recollection completion. So it was a pretty decent size or sampled survey of our members. And they also completed, I think, over 50 interviews to understand deeper what was causing how technology is impacting our work, and gave us 4 recommendations. And one of those recommendations was the right to disconnect. That was probably the first time we kind of heard this phrase or really thought about it, about that concept of a right to disconnect, a right not to have your iPhone beeping, a right not to be checking emails on the weekend. And a friend of mine in a British trade union, Prospect Trade Union, says to me, like, you wouldn't accept your employer just knocking on your door on a Friday evening at 9 o'clock telling you to send a letter to someone. So why would you accept a WhatsApp message or a LinkedIn message or an email or a phone call or whatever? Which is so very true. Around the same time as well, our international union that we're affiliated to, that FSU Australia is also affiliated to, Uni Finance, and we're also beginning to look at research and develop this concept of right to disconnect. And France had passed a law, and I think it was 2018 as well, that was the first time right to disconnect was really inserted into national legislation or any kind of regulation like that. So it was all happening around that same period of time, 2018, 2019. So we took that recommendation and said, right, that it just makes so much sense to our experiences and our members' lives. And we kind of put the phrase out to a few kind of activist groups, you know, what do you think about this? And the feedback was really strong. We wanted the union to push forward on that. And so we started off, and we chose World Mental Health Day in 2019 to launch the campaign for a right to disconnect. And we were really sort of proud that it was probably the first time, certainly in my lifetime, but that a trade union was center to the whole debate around World Mental Health Day. Because effectively employers have kind of occupied a lot of that space for a long time with kind of corporate solutions, and they're money-making solutions. I mean, it's a multi-billion global business, the whole wellness and well-being, and it's taken mental health out of a health and safety issue. It's taken work-related stress out of health and safety, where we feel it belongs, because health and safety tells you to look for the causes and remove the causes. It doesn't tell you to be more resilient, which is the employer's solution. You know, it actually says the employer, you got to do something. What's causing all of this absence? What's causing all of these sick notes of work-related stress? You know, change something. So we wanted to really shift it back into that sphere. So we launched it on World Mental Health Day, and I remember it was lucky, I suppose, and sometimes campaigns get a little bit of luck and a little bit of a nudge somehow by someone taking it up, or as Natalie said, I think one employer breaking the mold, or Mary's own employment breaking the mold, and you just get a boost out of that. And so when we launched it, the journalists who were interviewing myself and my colleagues were so in favor themselves of a right to disconnect. And it kind of dawned on us that journalists are possibly one of the worst impacted, because in the world of Twitter, you know, they have to be on 24/7, 7 days a week, responding to news cycles. It's such a global, all-consuming news world at the moment. So we kind of, they really egged it up. So we got kind of floor to floor and coverage, and it continued over a period of time, and that made right to disconnect a known phrase in Ireland. It was literally kind of unheard of until we put that call out. But then including our members in activity and involvement is really important as a trade union, because me saying something or my general secretary saying something is not half as powerful as local people talking about it in their coffee shop, or bumping into their politician in the street and saying it to them again, as someone else said earlier. It's that kind of engagement that really makes a big difference. So we undertook a petition, members-led petition, to the Minister for Business at the time, and that was, you know, pretty widespread participation, calling for legislation on the right to disconnect. And our approach was kind of twofold. We were looking at political legislation on a national level, but workplace agreements at an employer level. So in tandem with the petition to the Minister, which was calling on a legislative approach, we launched claims in our main workplaces, in the main banks that we have collective bargaining and union recognition. So our goal was to, I suppose, change the world of work via workplace agreements, setting standards, but also via national legislation, and use both to help and support each other. We had to do a little bit of work, I suppose, as trade unions, and as working in trade unions will know, things are not always straightforward and easy. So we had to do a bit of work convincing some of our national committees in different workplaces to really drive this home with their employments. So that took some time, and we invested, I suppose, time and patience and energy in just getting everyone on board to really drive it home. And we definitely were making progress. But I'm struck by Mary and Natalie, who were talking about kind of 12-year campaigns and 15-year campaigns. Ours has been, I suppose, a 3-year campaign. But again, if there's been a silver lining of a global pandemic, it was remote working became viable, number one, but people began to, I think, understand the negative impact that work has on our personal time and our work-life balance and all of those kind of things. So without a doubt, we conducted another survey about 4 months into the pandemic and working from home experience. I think about 70 to 80% of our members were working from home. It was only the great people in the branches really who kept the banking system operating in branches. I'm sure you have the same mix in FSU as well in Australia. But we did a survey again, and the numbers impacted by right to disconnect, or by a lack of right to disconnect, doubled during the pandemic. Like the second survey that we did was much stronger feedback. And we began then to get much better engagement from employers and from politicians. And the government basically committed at roughly the same time. So it was this dual approach. The government committed to a code of practice. A code of practice basically is non-statutory, but it's influential in setting expectations for employers, let's say. So they committed to a code of practice on the right to disconnect nationally, and we also got our first employer to break. And again, that's always a key thing. If you can get one, you then are able to combat all of those arguments, as Natalie said, about cost, about, you know, people taking the piss, you know, all that kind of stuff that employers say to you. So we got one of our big banks as well, which was good, to commit to a set of principles with us, and then they began to the dominoes, I suppose, began to fall, and we got 2 or 3 of our other big employments to change, and we successfully got a national code of practice, and that's all really just come in the last 6 months or so. So the what's the word? The efficacy, the how much it has changed our world of work is still an absolute open question. And I think changing workplace culture always is a longer and slower process. But regulation and agreements is an important part of changing that workplace culture. But it strikes me it's kind of similar to having an overtime agreement. So you have an agreement on overtime, but you still have to empower workers to feel confident enough to claim their overtime and to feel that they won't be victimized for actually putting in their overtime claims and not just doing unpaid overtime. So it's one thing having agreements and regulations, but you then really need to empower workers locally and to lead that change and to drive that change. And that will take time. So we've got to a place where we've got some agreements, not everywhere, some agreements, and we've got a national code of practice. And we need to continue to get more agreements. So we need to use the code of practice now to put it in front of employers and say, right, you need to sign up to this. And we're looking at some of the big tech companies as well next year. So some of the big US, I won't name them for fear of being sued, but some of the big US tech companies that are located in Ireland because of our extremely generous taxation system, or our frankly non-existent taxation system for multinationals. So we're looking at targeting them really on the right to disconnect next year, because our feedback from some, they're heavily non-union, but our feedback from some workers that we've held some kind of quiet workshops with is, you know, they're expected to work all the weekends and all the evenings, and the time zone differences between America and all that kind of stuff. So we're really looking to use that code of practice now to push it into non-union areas and begin to use it more as an organizing tool in the non-union areas than just our collective bargaining and union recognition. So that's kind of the story of our campaign. I would just add as well, the 2 presentations were absolutely fantastic earlier. I wish, to be honest, we knew about the work on safe leave or domestic violence leave. I can't remember what phrase you used, but I wish we knew about that a decade ago, because we, in our own ignorance, I suppose, didn't really understand it as a workplace issue up until around 2019. And it's only in the last couple of years we have achieved some agreements, so 10 days leave in some of our employments, and there's legislation going through our parliament at the moment to give that as a legal right to every worker. But had we known about it back in 2009, 2010, I think we could have helped a lot more people and supported a hell of a lot more people in those difficult situations. So it is conferences like this that, you know, are so vital to learning from each other. And I do think it's things like momentum that are really, really important in campaigns. And if you can get a win in one country, even as opposed to one employment, if you can get a win anywhere in the world on an issue, you can then build a really strong campaign. So look, that's our presentation on Right to Connect. So thank you very much, and happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Gareth. This is another one of our comrades that we have definitely built on the work of. We've started putting in a right to disconnect in our logs of claims now. We've managed to secure it at about 3 or 4 employers now. So it's at the very, very, very early stages, but it's a really important starting point. Now, I'm going to open it up for questions. I'll also acknowledge that I think it's 5 in the morning for poor Gareth. So we really appreciate you getting up so early to join us today. It's it's 5:45 here in Melbourne, so it's much more reasonable hour of the day. Now, for anyone who has questions, pop them in the chat, but we've got a couple of questions to get us started. One of the biggest challenges for activists is choosing the right issue to pursue at the right time. I know that COVID certainly created a set of circumstances where things like, for us in Australia, the right to disconnect suddenly became hugely relevant with so many people working from home. But I'd love to hear your reflections on why you chose to pursue your campaign at the time that you did. So I might go to Natalie first.
Red hot rage would be part of it, which is always a good motivator. But also, I don't, we weren't the only trade union and the only group of workers, organised workers, who were thinking about this when we decided we were going to pull out all stops and run the campaign for a universal entitlement. But we felt like we could bring something to the campaign that was probably uniquely ASU, and that was the voice of frontline practitioners. So we felt that the dialogue about paid family violence leave was very much like workers, employers, industrial right, bang heads, that's how it goes. And being the union for frontline family violence practitioners, we felt like we could come in and add an extra perspective, an extra voice to that debate, which said, as subject matter experts, as the people who do the work in the family violence space, just coincidence, we're all unionists, but if you put that aside, as the subject matter experts, we know the difference that this makes. And so I think, it's always weighing up those different interests. As Gareth was saying, it's about when there's an opportunity as well and trying to capitalise on those opportunities. The red hot rage and the fire in the belly, and sometimes you look at it and you think, oh, actually it does need to be us, because we can bring a unique perspective to this. And I'm sure Mary's experience of as an organisation, what you can bring to the discussions, one of those considerations.
Yeah, we'll go to Mary next. Thanks, Natalie.
Well, the impetus for the work we did on About Bloody Time actually came from 3 or 4 women who were great menstrual educators in Australia, but they understood that menstrual education in Australia at that point was they were on the fringe, and some people, felt as though it was almost a bit too fringe to come into the mainstream. So this was a classic case actually of a handful of women coming to me at the Trust with their ambition for reform around menstrual education. And so I listened to them, and I'll be honest, I was thinking, not sure about this, but I sat and listened. And when I said, what do you want to achieve? And they said, we want to get an accreditation to get menstrual education accredited from a sort of teaching point of view. And apparently I leant forward, and this is captured in the preface to the book. Apparently I leant forward and I said, oh, we can do better than that, surely. So it was, as I listened to them, I guess it fed, I think as an activist, you have to be ambitious for the kind of change you want to see, but not myopic and not romantic. And on the one hand, I also say that I would much sooner, as an activist, I would much sooner successfully mount the lesser hills than make unsuccessful attempts on Everest. But I don't want you to take that as being anti-ambition. What I'm saying is that there's no point to me in campaigning if you never actually make ground, or you don't make the ground you want to make. So I think making ground makes more ground. So that's how it started. It started because 3 or 4 women had the guts to come and have a conversation with us about what they wanted, and we just we laughed that day, and we pledged that we would get out there and do the work. And so it's almost the way movements grow, I think.
Absolutely, thank you. Something that strikes me about all of the campaigns that you've spoken about is that they touch on areas that were not part of public discourse. So certainly periods, very sensitive for many people. We've certainly been in the bargaining room putting that claim on the table, and even our own reps are cringing and internally dying inside, and we've had to do a lot of work with them. Family violence was certainly something that happened behind closed doors and wasn't discussed. And I think even the right to disconnect, which goes to work-life balance, there's been a persistent narrative here about how you're just lucky to have a job and you shouldn't be complaining if your boss can call you at night because you're lucky to have a job. What are your reflections on how we go about changing the dominant culture around these issues that we want to pursue for industrial entitlements? We have to start the conversation in changing how people view the issues. So how do we go about that?
I guess one of the ways we approached it from family violence leave perspective was we said we're going to first off ensure that all unions are singing from the same song sheet on this. And so we literally went around and went to every conference of every different union and said, this is deeply important to us. We're sure it's deeply important to some of you. We want it to be deeply important to all of you and to stand by it. But what we did was, which I just found so powerful, was having our members go and speak to other union members about what we do as unionists. And so, for example, we had frontline family violence workers standing on building sites at 6 a.m., toolbox meetings, standing on big concrete slabs and addressing, 300-400 building workers ready to pick up their tools for the day and saying, hey, when there was the Patrick's dispute at the waterfront and when we were fighting James Hardy and asbestos, we were really proud to stand on that picket line alongside you. That was your big dispute. We will always be there for you because that's what we do as unionists. This is our big one. And we want you to stand with us because that's what we do as unionists, solidarity. And I think that got a lot on board. But through that kind of first discussion, which is, okay, I might support you because you're telling me it's solidarity. That's what I do. I'm a unionist supporting another unionist. The engagement in the actual issue grew very rich.
Thank you, Mary.
Just quickly, the ability to enter into serious and constructive dialogue, honest dialogue with one another, which obviously puts me at odds, for example, in the debate about cancel culture, because I really worry about cancel culture because of that. Just a quick story. Melbourne Storm, for example, and some of you might be, rugby league followers, and others might be AFL followers and turn your nose up at rugby league. But Melbourne Storm is a top class rugby league club. We have been in partnership, Melbourne Storm and my outfit, for over a decade now, working on the issue of violence and abuse and respect. And how you can reduce violence and abuse towards women and children in particular. And the CEOs downwards, they have enculturated themselves. They have put all of their boys in their squads through the programs that we've developed of Be the Hero and whatever. We have worked in solidarity with them. And they would say now that one of the reasons they have the highest level of female members across Australia is because they've got their act together on and off the field. And then they would say the reason they've got their act together on and off the field around respect and genuine regard and inclusiveness is because they've worked shoulder to shoulder with us for a decade. And I just think that's proof positive of people standing together, I'm a proud feminist. I've been a feminist. The nuns at school and my father made me a feminist for all the wrong reasons. But I'm a proud feminist, but I also love men. I love the men in my life and I love working with men. And this is the way of the future, that men and women need to actually step up together on these big, wicked problems around abuse and violence and harassment in the workplace, let alone climate change and everything else.
Thank you, Mary. Gareth.
So I think kind of the two questions are a bit related in terms of how do you know the right issue and then challenges, I suppose. So, I mean, we're working on a number of campaigns. Not everyone has been as successful as this. I wish they were. So I'd love to say there is a kind of a scientific way to identify the right issues, and we hear lots of theories around it, like, but in reality, I mean, it's listening to workers, number one, and then showing leadership, and I don't just mean leadership from general secretaries or union officials, but leadership in workplaces from our activists around issues, and it's in some ways it's kind of hard to pinpoint why one will take off and another won't, but it just is. So if you're working on 4 or 5 issues, you'll often find 1 or 2 just capture the imagination of people and capture the horrific experience of people, positive or negative, but really hit home with a kind of a critical mass. And then momentum is really important, and momentum just comes from different things. So whether it's a workplace agreement or a national story or an international story, etc., momentum just drives a campaign on and brings it to a place where you maybe didn't expect it to go that quickly. But definitely, I mean, the simple, most basic thing is listen and sort of truly listen to what people are telling you, not what you want people to tell you, and not selecting the 2 or 3 anecdotes that justify your preconceived notion or idea, but actually challenging your own thoughts and processes to understand what workers are really complaining about, talking to you about, calling us about. So, and then obviously there is a bit of a science to data collection. So I'm sure we have advice centers, all of us, I think most unions have an advice center at this stage, and there's partnering with academics to do scientific research and study. So is that combination of just deliberately researching something and then just having your ears open and beginning to pick up, and then leadership in terms of really solidifying those demands. And I think Mary's point is excellent, that one of the roles that leadership can play is achieving that balance between ambition and the steps, tangible steps and demands that are winnable, that begin to make a difference, that actually change the whole context, which make your overall ambition more realizable. And I think that's what leadership can bring to an issue, is that kind of approach, I think, anyway.
Thanks, Gareth. Now we